This video is brought to you by Morning Brew. What if the Space Shuttle was designed to carry passengers? Believe it or not, in 1976, NASA planned to do just that. This shuttle design would be able to carry 86 passengers into high Earth orbit, operating a shocking 256 flights per year. What was the passenger space shuttle? What would have it been like to fly? And why was it never built? In the 1970s, the USA was planning a vast network of solar-powered satellites, or called SPSs, to wean the country off oil and avoid using nuclear power. These stations would have been huge and required vast lifting space planes like the Boeing Space Freighter or the Rockwell Starraker to get materials into orbit. A fascinating in-depth video that you can see right here. But hold on, there was an essential component of the SBS program that we completely skipped over. That the Starraker, for all its glory, was actually not designed to carry passengers. That these gigantic SPSs in orbit, 300 nautical miles above the Earth, would in fact require a huge workforce of zero-G workers as well. But how would they get up there? That role would fall on a different spacecraft entirely, essentially a passenger space shuttle. The project would be called the Personnel Launch System and would be very much like the space shuttle we have today, although its insides and actual support rockets would be very different. This is because the Space Shuttle was actually under development around the same time and was seen as an obvious leaping off point for any sort of personal ground-to-orbit system. So why not just design a passenger module and then put that inside of the Space Shuttle to turn it into a commercial transport? Well, hot off the creation of the Starraker, Rockwell International did just that. But just like Rockwell International, I bet there are a lot of things you want to get done too. But if you're anything like me, your mornings are full of distraction, endless playing TikToks, and hours browsing Reddit to get up to speed on the world's events. But that's all changed thanks to Morning Brew. Morning Brew is the free daily newsletter, Monday to Sunday, that gets you up to speed in a fun and clever way. It only takes 15 seconds and there are no paywalls. Just today, I learned more about Bezos's plans to become an astronaut and how you can bid to get the seat next to him. And what a cloud of insect cicadas look like on a radar. Ew, freaky but still pretty cool. These are the things in the past that I just don't have time to find out myself, but now I do, thanks to Morning Brew. Really, there's no reason not to subscribe to Morning Brew if you're interested in business, finance, or tech. Click on the link down below to get your news the new, quick, and modern way. Anyway, back to our friends at Rockwell International. This design from 1976 would be able to carry at least 68 passengers, although there are some concepts that would increase the capacity up to 86 if needed, or as low as 50 astronauts if the shuttle was going far from Earth. Passengers would have been divided into 4 different areas on board, with different passenger configurations over 2 decks. Section AA was the most dense at the rear of the cabin, with 4 seats across the top and 2 at the bottom. Section BB had the same density, but room on either side of the lower seats for cargo or other supplies for the mission. Then we have Section CC and Section DD. The cabin would have 4 doors to enter, and this is where they would be, with Section CC only having 4 chairs, 2 on each deck, and Section D only having 2 chairs on the lower deck to give enough room for the astronaut to maneuver around the cabin. There was also a ladder at the rear of the cabin to traverse the decks, and another at the front where the main airlock was, although likely there wasn't much in the way of floors between the cabins, as that would have been a waste of materials, and made the shuttle too heavy. As mentioned, there were actually 4 doors to enter the cabin when the shuttle was on the ground. They would be located at the top of the cabin where the normal shuttle cargo bay doors would be. These cargo doors would actually be removed from this version of the shuttle and replaced by a single fixed cover with spaces for those 4 doors. As this shuttle wasn't designed for any cargo and the module wouldn't be released in orbit, thus having these cargo doors actually being able to open up was completely unnecessary. Once in orbit, the passengers would depart from a new airlock section that was built at the front of the passenger module. It was expected that once the shuttle arrived into orbit, passengers would disembark and then the returning passengers would board back on board for the shuttle to return pretty much immediately back to Earth. To keep everyone cool in flight, as the internal thermal radiators had been removed from the cargo bay, the orbital shuttle would use water flash evaporators instead. For those who don't know what these words mean, water would be pumped through a hot membrane, cooling the shuttle down before being ejected into space, taking the heat with it. As the mission was pretty short, just up and back, this would be deemed suitable. For the missions that only required 50 passengers, the shuttle could reach an orbit of around 500 kilometers, with the extra space on board given over to more fuel tanks to reach this mission height. And then conversely, the 80-seater version had a shorter range, and the removal of 2 ground doors, replacing that area with the high-density BB section. The shuttle would return to Earth using the typical method that would be employed by its real-world equivalent. There were other designs for Earth-to-orbit transportation, a smaller version of the Star Raker, but research discovered that it would be cheaper and quicker to develop a simple booster rocket with a flyback orbiter hitching along for a ride. This would be more expensive in the long run, as the costs would be passed on for each booster built. Presented with 2 options, the government moved to go with the version that was the quickest and cheapest to realize at the time, instead of some sort of upfront expensive fancy smancy space plane that wouldn't require costly booster rockets. Like the SBS heavy lifter before, Boeing was called up to present their ideas for this booster concept. Instead of a series of boosters, Boeing had the idea to use a single, large conical booster instead of the solid rocket boosters that had been used in the Apollo program. This design would have 4 liquid rocket engines fed with a potent mix of liquid oxygen and liquid propane, easily giving enough thrust to get the whole apparatus to orbit. The shuttle's own engines wouldn't have been engaged until the booster had separated, freeing up room on board for the orbiter shuttle to carry more passengers. Once separated, the booster would use 10 small Aerojet AJ-10 engines to slow its descent, burning unsymmetrical diethylamine hydroxyzine. You know what, full disclosure, I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce this chemical compound. This seems really complicated. And if someone could explain this in the comments for me, just like really space it out so I could learn to pronounce this, that would be much appreciated. Anyway, back to it. This is actually a very toxic fuel for sure, but something that was easy to store on board. It would then cover its main engines with doors and then seal it against seawater and splash down off the coast for recovery. Each booster and orbital pair would have a lifespan of 14 years and would cost $12.6 million per mission, which would be about $100 million in today's dollars. For the whole program, NASA would need 26 boosters and 10 orbiters, a staggering high cost and much bigger than the shuttles we got today. It is very likely that had the SBS program gone ahead, NASA would have had to split up the various components of the personal launch system to various firms like the Apollo program, such as Boeing, who would build the first stage of the Saturn V, Chrysler, who would build the second, and Douglas, who would build the third, and so on and so forth. We might have seen Rockwell do the actual passenger cabin, whilst Boeing would do the booster. And also, had this been built, we would have seen the possibility of a commercial version. Space hotels would have sprung up, and there would have been a real possibility of operators filling those 86 passenger seats with paying customers. Clearly, there's a market for it today, and plenty of people would have paid for it, much like we saw when air travel first arrived on the market. We may have eventually seen a passenger module that was set out with comforts, such as bathrooms, a lounge section, or, and now this is completely crazy, an in-flight bar. But alas, this history never happened, and like the SPS program being cancelled, the extensive future of the shuttle's program was greatly scaled back, and there was never a need to send that many astronauts to orbit. All of this information comes from my good friend Scott at Aerospace Projects Review. You can check out his website here for all the nitty and gritty details on how the booster and orbital would have worked, and the actual factual science, which for us big brain people is like an all-you-can-eat buffet at the Golden Corral. Science. And if you want to support the channel further, then I suggest you jump onto Patreon, where you can see all sorts of rewards for those who support the channel. And lastly, come on over and join the Discord. We'll be chatting about this video and much more, and you can suggest topics and speak to me directly in our own community group. I've put a link down below. So thank you again so much for watching today's video.